All right. Hey, my name is Drew, and we are starting a new sermon series over these next few weeks. It's entitled Sifted, Increased Surrender in Times of Trouble. And you just heard this story that was read by Andrea from the Gospel of Luke. And of course, the Gospel of Luke is this account of the historical Jesus and what he was going through, as well as the followers of Jesus. And in this particular instance, we have Simon Peter, who is one of Jesus' disciples, who has this moment. And it's just this extraordinary moment because here he is, Jesus is talking about he's teaching and he's close to his death. But before he gets there, there's this conversation about who's going to be the greatest. And there's almost this, amongst the disciples, there's this competitive, like, we want to be first, we will be first, we will be first. And in the midst of this, in this conversation, Jesus actually explains to Simon Peter, he says this phrase at the end of this passage of Luke 22. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. Now, he says this phrase, and it's basically Satan, of course, is the word for adversary. And we believe as Christians that there is a being, an adversary called Satan. And Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, to sift Peter. And but I have prayed for you, Simon. And look at what Jesus says, that your faith may not fail. In other words, he's saying in the sifting process of the difficulty that will happen, I'm praying that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, look at what Peter says. Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. I mean, do you catch the audacity and the confidence of Peter to talk about what his journey is like and what he's so committed to before Jesus? Now, if you know anything about the story of Peter, the reason why I'm smiling and the reason why I'm almost kind of laughing at this is because Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. And of course, Peter would end up going through one of the most difficult seasons of his own journey, a time where he was saddled with shame and guilt for actually denying Jesus at Jesus' time of greatest need. Now, it's interesting, right? Because Peter has all this bravado, kind of machismo, like, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. I can do this, Jesus, And yet, Jesus knows, and Jesus, the reason why he talks about the sifting all of you as wheat is because he knows that there are parts of Peter that Peter doesn't even know about yet that still needs to be sifted. Now, have you ever sifted wheat before? You can just raise your hand. Neither have I. I've never done it. But what I've read about it is that sifting is this process, of course, where wheat, you to get the dust out and all the parts that are not pure and that's not good, this sifting process takes place where it's a refining period for the wheat to get rid of all those things, those impurities that perhaps would leave us with all sorts of extra stuff instead of the essence of what the wheat is. And so what Jesus is talking about then is he's talking about a process for Peter by which he's going to be sifted, where his own life, heart, character, everything about perhaps what he's known up to this point, the bravado, the machismo, whatever he's had needs to get sifted. And I think it brings us to this point that is unique. It's not unique to the Christian story, but it's one that I think a lot of Christians might miss. And here's the point. It's this. It's that suffering, trials, and difficulty, let's just put that in one package, are an essential part of the Christian journey. Now, here's the thing. Some people might think of faith as like, oh, I thought faith was something that would actually remove suffering, trials, and difficulty from my life or from my journey. But then you've probably missed the point, and you've probably missed the entire story of what Christian faith has always been about. Now, of course, there's a way that Christian faith teaches us to live in such a manner by which we won't have to fall into some difficulties if we make certain choices. But the reality is suffering, trials, and difficulty are an essential part of the Christian journey. And for Peter in particular, as he grows in his faith, as one of the kind of the most prominent followers of Jesus, he is somehow not removed from suffering, trials, and difficulty. But instead, Jesus is basically saying, hey, listen, you're actually going to go through this process. And I pray that your faith finds itself pure at the end of it. Now, I talked about this whole idea, though, of suffering, trials, and difficulty. And just to give you a framework, there's basically two kinds of suffering. Now, of course, this generality is just that. It's a generality. So I don't want to make this like the end all be all. But in general, there's two buckets of suffering. One is the consequences of our actions. Like I mentioned, kind of you reap what you sow. So suffering comes on us. Like some of us might be like, oh my goodness, like I'm having all of these health issues. And the reality is maybe the reason why you are having these health issues is because you're playing video games all day and eating Cheetos and Korean fried chicken every day or something, like, and, you're like, God, why in the world is this suffering coming to me? Well, the reality is you reap what you sow, and that's a biblical principle. And so there's a kind of suffering that's a consequence of our actions. But there's also a kind of suffering and difficulty that is simply the result or the product of a fallen world. Now, when we talk about a fallen world, again, if you're not a Christian here, welcome. Just want to give you a quick framework of what we think about evil and kind of how it exists in the world that we live in. And again, this is just a Christian view, and I'd love for you to get this kind of perspective. Basically, there's the idea that sin enters the world, and the world itself, there are patterns of the world. For instance, in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, the world is another way of saying the fallen world that we live in is a broken place where we experience brokenness, pain. There's tornadoes, there's pandemics, there's all sorts of brokenness in the world. So that's number one, there's the world. Number two is there's something called the flesh. And the flesh is basically like our sinfulness. It's the fact that every single one of us, no matter how good we are, all of us have these proclivities towards falling into temptation, towards being people who lack integrity here or there. And, whether you're a Christian or you're not, I think we can all agree that all of us have these tendencies to make mistakes at different moments and to even not follow even the moral laws that we put up for ourselves, right? So there's the flesh and sin. And lastly, there's this thing called Satan or the adversary. Now, again, this is a Christian worldview of what it means about evil. And remember, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about how Christianity is really gives us, I believe, a very compelling view of reality. And in reality, these products of a fallen world, the flesh, and Satan, means that all of us will go through suffering, difficulty, and trial. Now, as I mentioned, though, Christianity is a faith that gives us the resources to actually, in the midst of the pain, suffering, and difficulty that we go through, we can actually see it. One perspective of it is that we grieve it, of course, but another way that we approach it is it's a way of refining us. It's a way of sifting us. And of course, we're in the midst of this global pandemic. And what if this was also a time that God was sifting you and sifting me? What's amazing is that Peter would actually later write to the suffering church in Asia Minor. He'd write this letter, and check out what he writes in 1 Peter. Look at what he writes as on the other side of having made it through incredible seasons of doubt, depression, feeling like he's totally rejected his Savior. Look at what he writes. He says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time." Now, look at what Peter says. Look at what he's writing. And remember, this is on the other side of him having gone through suffering, trial, difficulty, failure. On the other side of it, Jesus forgives him. Jesus resurrects from the grave. And this is what Peter says. "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials." Now, there's no doubt to me that Peter is writing this from the perspective of someone who's had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. Now, look at what he says. "These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith," in other words, the sifting of your faith, "of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." Wow. Here's Peter. He's talking about how suffering, difficulty, trials are an essential part of the Christian journey. It's because there's a sifting that's done. Now, this doesn't mean that we pursue it and that we say, "God, please give me suffering." That would be masochistic. And of course, we don't do that. But instead we say, God, come what may, whatever I might find myself in today. And perhaps there's a sifting that you've experienced in this season, because all of us have. And what if it's in this moment that what God is doing, as mysterious and as crazy as it might be, is that he's sifting us. He's doing something. And guys, I don't claim to know what the reasons are, but I trust that what he's doing is he's refining us, he's sifting us, and he's praying that our faith might come out on the other side more sturdy, stronger than it's ever been before. Richard Rohr, I can't find where he wrote this, but I heard him say this one time. He said, the only spiritual lessons someone can learn after the age of 21 comes through suffering and failure. And, every part of me wants to revolt against this, right? It's like, what are you talking about? I want success. But, as I look back on my own life, man, the only times I've grown spiritually have been when it's been a desert, when it's been difficult seasons. And really the times when success has come my way, or any kind of illusion of success, really what it's taught me is how arrogant I am. Or what it's done is it's given me this view that somehow I'm better, or I've arrived and I'm better than I truly am. Last week, Tina and I, we got into a big argument on Monday, and it was like this argument over something silly. It was over the fact that we had, these bags laying around in the kitchen, and I was like, where do these bags go? And it erupted into this, to this loud argument. And what's funny is lately I've been on these webinars where they've asked me to speak on emotionally healthy leadership in the time of a pandemic. And I'm like, after my fight with Tina, I was supposed to go on one of these webinars, and I'm like, holy cow, what a joke. Like, here I am trying to give this illusion that somehow I've got everything under control. But the reality is this season is really hard, and it's put a stress on my family, my marriage, my kids. And it was a wake-up call, like, wow, God, you're sifting me even further right now. And so, for me, I have to go on these webinars and basically say, hey guys, here's the reality. We are in the midst of a global pandemic, and God is sifting all of us, including me. And I don't know what great things I have to say other than, God, help us. We need your mercy. And so here's a question I want to ask you. In this season, what is God sifting in you? What's he sifting in you? Greater surrender, greater trust, greater humility. Whether your finances or your job have taken a hit, whether you've been in this stressful season in your marriage or in your relationships or your family, what is he sifting in you?